Go ahead and get started here. Happy Wednesday, everyone, and thanks for being here with us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Erica McKellar, and I'm with the Fiscal Affairs program at NCSL. And as part of my role with NCSL, I'm NCSL's liaison to the National Association of Legislative Fiscal Offices, or NALFO. And NALFO is one of the professional staff associations associated with NCSL, and it's really your organization. Every legislative staff person with any fiscal responsibilities is automatically a member of NALFO. And one of the things that NALFO does is host a professional development seminar each fall. And since we're not able to meet in person this year, the NALFO Executive Committee wanted to offer some virtual programming like this one throughout the fall and winter. These sessions are being recorded and will be available on our website. So many of you are probably assigned policy areas and agencies to know the ins and outs of, and this session is really designed to help provide some best practices and advice for learning about your agencies and evaluating agency budget requests. Our two speakers today are Melody DeBussey, the Director of the Senate Budget and Evaluation Office in Georgia and President of NALFO, and Kirk Fulford, the Deputy Director of the Fiscal Division of the Legislative Services Agency in Alabama. And Kirk is also a NALFO Executive Committee member. Melody was appointed as the Director of the Senate Budget and Evaluation Office in 2013. She joined the Georgia State Senate staff in 2011 and previously served as the office's Deputy Director. Her role includes producing the appropriations bill, as well as providing fiscal and budgetary analysis to the State Senate and its committees. Kirk Fulford leads the Fiscal Division of the Alabama Legislative Services Agency, a nonpartisan office tasked with providing accurate and objective fiscal information to the Alabama legislature. Kirk was first employed as a fiscal analyst in the office in 1996 and has been with the office for 25 years. He was appointed Deputy Director in 2017. My colleague Emily and I will be monitoring the chat throughout this presentation. So if you have any questions today or comments, please feel free to drop those in the chat box. Or we want this to be kind of informal, so please feel free to unmute yourself and participate. And with that, Melody and Kirk, I will share my screen and let you take it away.
Thank you, Erica. I appreciate the opportunity to join you and talk about how we go about reviewing a budget request. Slides, okay, here we go. Thank you. So in our case, so I think the first thing you need to know is in what context you're looking at a budget request. In our case, our fiscal year begins in October and ends in September. So we just started our fiscal year 2022, but on November the 1st, agencies are supposed to submit their budget request for fiscal year 2023. That timing is a little difficult for us, obviously, because of the time gap between the initial request and the fiscal year close date, but it's the timing that we all have to work under. So the budget requests are due November the 1st. The governor has her internal budget hearings with agencies between that point in time and December. He or she is required to submit a budget recommendation to the legislature in either January or February, depending upon which year it is in the quadrennium. So at that point in time, we do our budget hearings, and that usually coincides with the governor's submittal of their budget recommendations. So it's kind of after the fact, to be honest with you, but we pick it up and run with it from there. And it basically do it on the first day of the session or the first several days of the session, coinciding with my presentation regarding the financial condition and revenue estimates as our starting point for how we're building our budgets. So those hearings kind of take whatever form the legislature wants them to take. Sometimes we get down into the weeds, so to speak, in terms of individual agencies and everything they've asked for and what they're doing. Sometimes the budget hearings take the form of, obviously, if we have an election cycle that has a great deal of turnover, then we have new members with new needs as far as what they want to know about individual agencies. And sometimes the budget hearings are driven by other issues, such as financial condition of the state. If we're losing revenue sources or revenues are declining, we have to make decision points going forward. And so we may take a different approach in those kind of scenarios. We obviously are going to also take a different approach in this upcoming year based on the amount of federal funds that we've received for the pandemic. We're going to have to shed a light on that and make sure that we're planning for when those funds run out. So anyway, our state is an incremental budgeting state, which means that we're not zero based. We're not performance based. We basically start with what we ended with and plus or minus from there. So anyway, that's how we began. That's our process, and we'll lay that out. I just want to lay that out before we move forward. So next slide, Erica, please. So as Erica mentioned, most of you are in an analyst role or responsible for a policy area or a set of agencies. And so before you can pick up a budget request and get into the weeds as far as trying to analyze the needs or the request of an agency, you absolutely have to know a little bit of something about what the department does. You cannot review or make recommendations or even ask questions about the budget until you get to that point. And so you have to know what they do, generally, how they do it. And a big key is the sources of revenue that operate the agency that you're looking at. For example, it may be an agency that's wholly supported by a general fund, or in our case, an education trust fund appropriation that has no other sources of revenue. Or it could very well be an agency that has multiple revenue streams, federal funds, and license fees, for example, or other types of funding streams that support their operations. And so that's a critical thing to know before you begin reviewing a budget. Another thing you absolutely have to know are the instructions that the agencies are given to fill out the budget request. So in our case, those agency instructions go out in September. Those instructions basically tell the agency the forms they have to use, the information they need to submit, general information about the expenditure categories that they're supposed to report on, fees that they're supposed to consider, retirement rates, health insurance rates, and things of that nature. And it breaks it down, gives a definition of each one of the expenditure categories so that the agencies know what they have to put in each line. And for an analyst to know that as well is very important, again, before you get into the process of reviewing what the agencies ask for. Knowing what other states do in regards to that similar area is also very important. Again, knowing who they are, what they do, when and how is very critical in this process. Next slide, Erica, please. So again, before you start, you need a positive working relationship with the agency that you're trying to review. Obviously, that implies that you make contacts if you don't already have them, or build upon the contacts that you already have. Know who in the governor's budget office is also the analyst responsible for that area. Make sure that you know who they are and the questions that they've already asked before you get to the point of starting asking questions about the agencies. NCSL is a great resource for everyone in terms of what other states are doing, making contacts with staff in other states that have similar areas of responsibility. So again, learn what your office is doing with the budget request. What are you asked to do? What's the final product going to look like? Generally, in our case, it's a matter of getting prepared for or responding to questions that come up during our budget hearing process. Our members like a really concise, short version of an agency's budget request, what they've asked for, what they've been doing with the money that they've been provided. And in addition to that, if we see anything in our review of their budget requests that they need to ask about during the hearings, we provide a list of questions for the members to ask the agency head or the person presenting at the hearings that will try to direct and answer toward the questions that we have posed and the ones that we think the members need to know about. So are there things that you always are expected to know as an analyst for an agency. There's absolutely 100%. You need to know how that agency has been funded over the past several years. Don't expect you to memorize it, but I do expect my people to have some sort of historical information or background to where we can get to what's the level of funding for this agency over the last 5 years. You know, have they spent all their money? We have a process where we basically allow reverted money at the end of the year to get reappropriated to the agency. So a budget request, we have to take that into consideration because it's kind of considering what you didn't spend last year in addition to what you're requesting this year as the total funding stream for an agency. Next slide, Erica. So where can you learn about the agency budgets and operations? So everybody's got a website these days. Everybody has an organizational chart that you can find information about who you need to contact and about what. I expect our analysts, and I'm sure every other state does as well, to have access to prior budgets. What has the agency asked for over the previous several years? Have they met their goals? Have they hired the personnel that they set out to do? All that information can be found on the prior budget request, and in our case, since it's an incremental budgeting, we know what they did in the previous year on the budget request. So they have to report actual receipts and expenditures for the previous year, budgeted information for the year that we're in, and then for what they're requesting, have to show that in a separate column as well. So we have all that information on a single budget request, and we can go back historically and look at how that's played out. And that's very important. So again, so longitudinal data, that's back to what I mentioned, historical spending and revenues. You can't basically tell or make a recommendation to a budget chairman about what an agency may or may not need if you don't have an idea what they've done over the previous several years. Have they hired the number of people that they told you they were going to hire? Have they spent all of their appropriated money that they were supposed to spend? So it's hard to recommend to a budget chairman, yes, an agency needs a $5 million increase when they turn back over $2 million at the end of the previous year. So those are things that you have to basically be familiar with and know about. And any kind of outcome measures that an agency produces, some of those are done on a website. Some of those are done based on reporting requirements that your state may have. So just be mindful of that. And again, studies and audits or other conversations with other agencies and staffs, that's really important. And go visit your agencies. So, you know, during the interim between sessions is a prime opportunity for you to go and see the agency people that you talk to. Sometimes you haven't laid eyes on the people, especially in COVID worlds. You may not have seen them over a period of a couple of years. Go talk to them, go to the agency and visit with them, see how they operate. It helps you get an understanding of what the agency does and how they're utilizing the money that's appropriated to them. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Certainly very key in that world. Next slide, Erica. Again, visit your agencies and ask questions. So build relationships with an agency contact, but don't be a pest. So we've had situations where an analyst in reviewing an agency budget request would, not gather all of their necessary questions to make a single request or maybe one or two, and would repeatedly call or email or try to contact an agency. Understand the agency has other things to do. So you need to plan your questions accordingly. Make sure that you ask them as concisely as possible and don't take up too much of their time, but demand that they give you an answer to the questions that you ask. And if there's a problem with that, report that to your supervisor, because they tend to have a little better way of making agencies cooperate if you can't get them to cooperate. But again, I think a really key point, building the relationships, don't be a pest, be a help and not a hindrance. Next slide, please. So items to consider when analyzing a budget request. You understand you are always looking at the agency's priorities, not the legislature's. The legislature may have a different set of priorities altogether. The agency may not even be relaying the priorities of the governor. They may just be relaying their own priorities. And the agencies tend to think only in their internal world. They don't really care about the financial condition of the state. They request what they request based on what they think they need. So in our case, that tends to change occasionally when we run into a situation where our financial condition is not as strong as it needs to be. We may change the questions that we ask in terms of and change how we ask agencies to submit a budget request. We may ask them to reflect what a 5% cut or level funding would do, as opposed to just normal situation where an agency can basically ask for whatever it is they think they need. And sometimes that's problematic in terms of trying to get down to what they really need versus what they want. So also understand that most agency proposals are not fully developed. They may not even come together until your session starts and bills get processed and things of that nature. Not all states also have access to agency total data. So just be aware of that. Figure out a way to get the most information you can and build that information and database as you can build it. And also understand that timing of request is critical. As I mentioned, our budget requests for 23 are due November the 1st. That's a long period of time between when an agency requests a budget and when the budget year even starts. So things may change between the budget request and the actual start of the fiscal year. We always have to make sure that we're aware of that. And understand that the estimates that are provided by the agency in terms of their revenue stream, revenue sources, are the estimates that they were able to come up with at the time they submitted the budget. All right, next slide, Erica. So saying all that, you've got a lot of information to review for an agency, right? Each individual agency, each individual budget request has its own set of information, and you've got a lot of information to review. So focus your efforts based on your research and general analysis. Don't necessarily have time to look at all the change in the cushions of the couch. You need to focus your time on the most important things. The big ticket items, personnel and employee benefits are usually one of our biggest items that agencies request and carry on from year to year. You also have to pay attention on that in terms of an agency who, if somebody's going to fudge on their budget request in Alabama, it's going to be in personnel and benefits, because they'll have a number in mind that they want, and they'll run out of place to put it in terms of travel and other expenses. So it'll all get sorted up to personnel. They'll show that they need 200 additional employees, and knowing full well they haven't hired more than 5 in the last 3 years. So that's really something to pay attention to. All of that information should be available on the budget request, regardless of which state you're operating under. Personnel information is usually there, and that's one of the big ticket items that our agencies request. Try to find trends and big issues. Again, request for new personnel if they don't fill positions. Big ticket capital improvement requests. Pay attention to computer equipment and other types of requests, and focus your attention on things that look like they're going to pay a big impact on the agency's budget request or recommendation from the governor. So your analysis, you also need to compare, again, this is easy for us because we're an incremental budgeting state, prior year actuals, existing operations, and what the agency requests are all laid out in front of you. And another piece to ours is we have a cover sheet where the agencies are supposed to go and tell us exactly why they're requesting an increase by expenditure item. So if they requested 20 additional personnel, they have to associate a dollar figure with that, employee benefits with that, and explain why they need that many personnel. So that information is very helpful for us when it becomes time to look at what they have asked for and why they asked for it. Knowing the means of finance is really critical, especially in the world now where we've got so much federal funds in our system. There's going to be an issue with a fiscal cliff in the next couple of years. So any way that agencies have used federal funds to prop up existing programs or to establish new programs is going to be an issue. I know it's an issue for us. It's probably going to be an issue everywhere else as well. We have to make sure that we keep an eye on that. Identify new and expanded programs. And any expected cost increases. Like I mentioned, our budget instructions include costs for health insurance and retirement, and any changes to those numbers are factored in on the front end. So, and also pay attention to any new legislation or court mandates. Those have an impact on the budget request as they happen. And we certainly need to make sure that we're aware of everything that comes up with the agencies as you're reviewing the budget request. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a good one. Gather everything you can. Try to focus when gathering the information on information you'll actually use again. And make sure that you have as much of that as possible in an electronic format. Save it in some place on your computer system where you can get back to it, because believe me or not, you'll need it again at some point in time. It'll come back up. So gather it all, use it all, and keep it all as much as you can anyway. But you have to prioritize that. You don't have to keep every little single piece of paper, but just keep the stuff that's important to you. We keep all of the budget requests from every agency on our own cloud, so there's no reason for you to create a separate version of that. There's a way to get back to that budget request for the last 15, 20 years without creating a separate repository for it. So just keep that in mind. Next slide, Erica. All right, so I shared a lot of front-end information. Here's an example. So Forestry Commission coordinates and administers Alabama forests through landowner assistance programs, urban forestry, reforestation. One of the biggest things they do is volunteer fire department programs and forest fire prevention and putting out fires. So they've got a fleet of vehicles, heavy equipment for that purpose. So big tractors, big trucks, things of that nature. This is a very real scenario that we had in the last budget cycle. So the commission wanted to replace all of their fleet of vehicles. It's costing them too much money to keep the vehicles running. Can't find parts. So they just thought they needed to buy a brand new fleet, which, that was their request. Let's replace them all at one time. So budget chairman called and asked to come to his office and on Thursday of that week to talk about that scenario. So the question is, what are a few of the things that you might want to know before that meeting with the Forestry Commission, and to be able to have an intelligent conversation with the budget chairman about what they really need versus what they're asking for. So I'll stop right there for a couple of minutes and see if anybody has any ideas about information that you might want to have. So, all right, so I'll let you know what I've spent time developing before that meeting. So needed to have information about those are they? What is their current condition? Do you really need to replace all of them at the same time? How much is each one of those vehicles? Is there any afterlife to the ones that you presently have? Could you sell some and generate a little revenue stream to help in this replacement? And what is it really costing you to maintain the fleet that you've got? Are you handling that in-house, or do you handle that through contract with someone else. So those are some of the issues that we discussed, and we wound up paring down their request. They did not need all the vehicles or the equipment that they needed replaced at the same time. We were able to phase in a replacement program over a series of 5 years and cut the costs dramatically at the same time. So those are some of the issues that we discussed, and that was the example that I thought of. And I think Erica, I think that's the last of my slides, Erica. So I think it's Melanie's turn.
Yeah, thanks. We can go to the next one. I think you guys too had written down in the chat some examples of asking for things like inventories and repair costs. And so that kind of gets towards some of the things we're going to walk through now. So some of the key questions that, a lot of folks will ask right off the bat is, to really identify the problem or issue. So you look at it from what is the request ultimately trying to remedy. We also a lot of times talk about making sure that they articulate the impact or results, right? So they're looking at the, I think, consequence of the current situation. I think somebody mentioned in the chat too about, if they didn't, during the pandemic, they didn't use equipment, let's say, as much, that might have extended the life cycle. Some of those things are important to kind of see, hey, what is their actual asset life look like? And that can be evaluated as they have kind of more usage or not over the years. Also looking at kind of how well the budget request is going to solve the problem, or we kind of refer to it internally as the degree of the solution, right? A lot of times folks will try to sell a cure-all. If you just give me some resources, this will solve any problem you can think of, or specifically, it's sometimes more helpful to get granular and ask, kind of, hey, what specifically would resources do to solve this problem? So it's not just, specifically the vehicles and kind of Kirk's example, but also looking down through, some assistance to some of the positions that they might have added, or looking at other ways to leverage resources within the organization. And then finally, kind of what are additional options, right? So whether solutions are available when you're kind of looking through things. And those are kind of some of the key issues we'll roll through. Next slide, Erica. So when we talk about the problem being addressed or the consequences of the current situation, a big piece of that is gathering backgrounds, right? And so especially that can be really tough when you're newer to try to understand the context for kind of why this specific request was made at this time. It's helpful to ask, internally to your organization and also to the stakeholders, what do we know about this specific situation? It's also helpful to focus on, kind of what you're trying to avoid, the cost of aged vehicles breakdown, which are assumed to be a higher cost, or sometimes look at those linear impacts. What do we know is likely to happen or result if we don't address this issue? And so that happens a lot when you look at analysis around backlogs or other types of workload issues, concerns. Wait times is a big one too. Agencies often assume sometimes that their proposal or those resources are, going to, they skip right to the solution and don't necessarily articulate the problem that this will remedy, letting you kind of fill in that this is a cure-all for whatever issue you think they need to address at their agency. Also, sometimes it's helpful to that not all resource deployment is equal, right? So we look at things like cost to benefit ratios or return on investment scenarios to try to understand how this specific resource or appropriation or budget addition is going to accomplish their ultimate goal. And then finally, it's important to understand what the flexibility is in some of the requests. So for example, if an equipment purchase is predicated on a staffing level being assigned, you don't want to necessarily, appropriate equipment and then not have the commensurate staff. But some requests don't have any flexibility. So if it's mandated by statute, or let's say a settlement agreement that your state has reached, sometimes those are specific amounts that are determined ahead of time about what type of investments that you have to make into certain structures, which will kind of lend into the next slide, Erica. So one of the things we hear a lot, I think, is the difference between kind of wants and needs. And it's really common, I think, if for folks that have been working in a field for a while, to hear from agencies like, we used to have this amount of money, or we used to have this staffing level, because they've based it to whatever their high water mark is for whatever resource allocation they had. But a lot of times it's helpful to ask them what resources they need to fulfill their statutory mission. In economic downturns, we often have limited resources, and agencies do too, to fund some of their priority operations. And so a lot of times it's helpful to really try to parse out what does the agency need in order to perform the foundation components of their mission, and then use your judgment to determine what a true need is and what is a want. And so you can help prioritize that way. Some things that they might put their want as their number one priority, if you ask them, let's say, to rank, when really their most crucial mission need could be the one that needs to be elevated above what they think will make running their organization maybe more seamless. Next slide, Erica. So when we kind of evaluate remedies or how well the budget request is going to solve the problem or improve a situation, I would say the math is always one of those things that seems to be kind of a foundational issue. I definitely know there's some of my staff that's on the call today that could tell you that they have found just math errors. A lot of times agencies are running some situations where they're considering lots of things before they make their final proposal. And sometimes those situations have changing dollar values that might not be linked up to ultimately, the amount or the component costs that get requested. So, their commissioner or their financial person, financial officer that's testifying could very well be thinking of a math calculation that's kind of disjointed from what you're talking about when you talk to allocation resources, because they could be multivariate and really extensive. And so sometimes just making sure that component costs will help you sometimes check the math, and usually in your favor, be able to have a better discussion about how to allocate resources. I also think sometimes there's things that are assumptions about extra costs or inadvertent costs. One of the things that comes out a lot is indirect cost allocations. Some agencies have really complicated federal or specific legal indirect cost allocations, which cause it sometimes look like costs are different from their base components. And so those are types of factors that you want to consider or at least contemplate as you look at some of the budget requests. And then when you're looking at technical components, you kind of want to make sure that you discuss with the agency or with your budget colleagues and other offices the assumptions they made, even about how they're physically going to carry out that operation. So if they're going to add staff, what locations are they going to add them at? If they're going to hire people at this market salary, is that consistent with the last hire they were able to make within the agency? Those types of things can be a lot of work on the front end, but can save you a lot of work on kind of the back end of making sure that, you don't add staff to an agency that doesn't have an office space to roll them through. I think it's also looking at unrealistic assumptions. I think a lot of times people are really optimistic and they have, the best intentions that they're going to maximize revenue, or that they'll see, great leveraging for matching funds, for example, when maybe that might not always prove true. And the other thing is to watch out for empty authority, particularly with federal funds, so that an agency doesn't have kind of carte blanche to do something that might not be in line with their kind of statutory or agency core mission. Next slide, Erica. Yeah, so the biggest thing, and for members that we work with every day, and probably a lot of members that you guys will work with, who cares and why, the perspective to evaluate or consider various views. And I think a lot of times when we were talking about making sure we understand where the best analysis is taking place, where we're looking at different perspectives or stakeholders, and really understanding for those folks, like what is at stake. Another key piece is the motivation of knowing, what is the goal that has to deal with some of the remedy. What is the goal for what we hope to resolve, and why do we hope that is going to link up to what's the resolution that we're working on. And in some cases, making sure that you're looking at, is there a specific slant? Like, is there, and just being aware of, a glimpse into kind of what the motivation and the minds are of kind of how folks are advocating for maybe this solution versus alternatives that you might have identified, and maybe why that seems to be the one that was selected. And It's always important to, in most organizations, to not carry the water for advocates. You know, a lot of those conversations are around only agencies can advocate for themselves. So, you know, if they're not willing to say this is the need they have, then you might have to have more discussions with them about their ability to conduct their business and fulfill their statutory mission. You know, if they don't recognize or share in the idea that this is something that they also feel like they need to address. So that they're the ones too that are advocating for all the resources that ultimately may be assigned towards them. Next slide, Erica. The executive branch partnership is really important, I think, for a lot of analysts, and obtaining information from the executive branch is a big part of the process, especially since in Georgia, I think like in Alabama, the governor's office gives us a good kind of recommendation point. A lot of times the chain of approval that exists in executive agencies often lends best to written requests. And so sometimes it's helpful, like Kirk said, you know, to exercise stewardship of time and trying to put your request together concisely. But generally, you know, if folks are advocating or would like a partnership of resources, they should be able to answer questions about how they derive those figures, what they considered when they were also recommending that request, and how the agency is really going to operate within those resource allocations. So even the agency should be able to answer questions about a request that they are, you know, would like you to fund. Sometimes, you know, it's helpful too to get the same data sets so that you can see kind of what they're looking at. So a lot of times we request a lot of data electronically from agencies to be able to do similar analysis and see if we get to the kind of the same or even different kind of analysis. And then really also escalating kind of as necessary. You know, managers are there a lot of times to lend support, especially when you're new, to be able to navigate sometimes the tricky relationships that exist in the agency hierarchies of what data that you requested or what questions you're going to ask. So I would say, you know, definitely feel open to meet with your manager as issues arise that you might need to have some assistance in navigating some of those things. In some cases, some of these issues or concerns or proposals could be remedies for challenges that have existed and persisted long before you started in the role. Next slide, Erica. Yeah, so we'll ask folks how many people have, we'll start with, I don't know if we want to do, I think you can in Zoom do your little hand wave. Yeah, how many folks have challenges getting data? So if you've ever regularly had challenge obtaining data from agencies, and then we can kind of talk about maybe some kind of techniques, or if somebody wants to share techniques you found to be especially effective for obtaining data or statutory authority that maybe your state has that gives you kind of access to the type of information. And the same is true on managers, right? A lot of times, even though you might have assistance of a lot of the managers in your office that are escalating and maybe interceding in situations, trying to get folks to, you know, have challenges getting data back from agencies for sometimes legal or other kind of operational reasons. So kind of
feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to share any of your experiences. I know Zoom is kind of hard sometimes for participation, but if anybody would like to share their experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if not, we can kind of move through, because I know after this we'll move into Q&A anyways. If you want to, yeah, move into the next slide, Erica. Yeah, so part of, I think, you know, we talked about kind of 6, you know, some best practices that we wanted to share. So, you know, whenever possible, right, it's helpful to work and have a really good relationship with your colleagues. Kirk talked about that too. Definitely stewardship of time is really helpful to make sure that when you're having conversations that you're being thoughtful of the time investment and commitments for meetings that other folks have made. And then also, we do a lot of other state searches to get the benefits of what the experience has been of similar or consistent situations that have occurred in other states. And it looks like California maybe has a centralized accounting system. So that's really helpful if you have access to real-time accounting data. We also have that in Georgia, which makes things a lot smoother when you're trying to get to just financial basis. And then a lot of times it's helpful to understand your membership. So the analysts and Senate budget all kind of staff a specific subcommittee of appropriations, and each legislator likes to digest and consider information slightly differently. And that deliberative process might be slightly different for how members are best interested in receiving the information that they need to make some decisions about what type of investments and recommendations they want to make to the full committee. Definitely would be interested in hearing about kind of some other folks, if there's anybody who wants to, like Erica said, unmute and share kind of your experience or type in the chat too. I'm happy to kind of read those through. I think that's really helpful to hear how folks have any best practices.
So any questions for Melody and Kirk? I have a couple, but
Yeah, I think if you want to go to the next slide, there's just the 6 questions that are kind of key questions asked, and we can kind of use that as, I think, one of the backdrops, kind of maybe, if there's, and those are kind of things that we've kind of talked about, but those are kind of 6 key questions that can be really helpful as you do budget analysis. But yeah, definitely open for questions at this point.
I have a question. You talked a lot about the importance of kind of visiting agencies and that you can only learn so much from documents. And I guess I'm wondering if you have any sort of tips for legislatures and staff that might still be doing at least some work kind of remotely and some things virtually in the next session.
Yeah, so Zoom, for example, has offered an even better opportunity to conduct some of those. No, you're not going to the agency site, but you are able to meet with more people on a continuous basis if you can get everybody scheduled at the same time. So you can at least see someone and possibly more so than you could prior to the pandemic when it was, you physically had to go across town to someone's office space to be able to talk to them. So it afforded a new set of opportunities to engage and become familiar with individual people. But obviously you did miss out on, and are still missing out on, the going to sites and visit sites in person.
Yeah, it sounds like in Mississippi, if you guys have a checklist for new folks, it's helpful to kind of have a process, right? So even if you can't go on site, I think, especially given the kind of the cyclical nature, especially that we have, and I think in Georgia and a lot of states have, where, this type of year, it's helpful to do these types of check-ins, even if we would traditionally maybe do them on site. But now we kind of either do virtual kind of calls or, phone calls style, send email follow-ups, to be able to work through the same type of information gathering that you might have had. But I definitely think that Zoom has helped give what used to be a lot of conference calls. Now you can see if, when folks turn on their cameras and stuff, a lot more reactions to information and share screens to work through spreadsheets in a way that maybe, we didn't get kind of before, where, it was, hey, come sit in this conference room, we'll show you this presentation, and hope that you digest it all. And in some cases now, this format allows you to kind of think on it a lot longer, kind of given the fact that, you save some time on maybe travel, but you also, I think, have more follow-up continuous conversations.
Tina has a question. What are some techniques to help with those budget requests that tend to always come in after the deadline?
Yeah, we call those offline requests, right? So I think for here, I'd love to hear what other folks do, but one of the things that we do in Georgia for the ones that come kind of offline or after the formal submission process is really ask about, hey, why wasn't that included kind of in your original process? Like what changed? Because they generally come either right before we're getting ready to adjourn or right after they were supposed to be submitted. So, hey, what is this situation that's elevated this to wait until the next year or defer this request for another time versus making it more emergent? And I think trying to tease out those pieces usually helps refine what resources are more needed versus which ones maybe people want. And they're hoping, if they have something that's more emergent, maybe they can also lay the groundwork for some things that, they hope to build foundational for the future, increasing resources.
Yeah, we have for example, our State Department of Education is historically bad about getting their budget request in after the November the 1st deadline. And to some extent, it's about the fiscal year situation. So school years and fiscal years don't align. And they're having to gather information from a school year that just concluded to make a budget request for a fiscal year that won't start until another 12 months later. So it's difficult with them as far as timing. It's difficult for our Medicaid agency as far as timing. We usually allow them a little extra time to get that in. Obviously, in a situation like this year where our session will start in early January, that becomes more complicated on the executive side because they have to have the governor's recommendations laid out prior to the start of the session in January. So their time allowance gets compressed and becomes problematic on that end. We generally don't receive formal requests after the session starts, but we do receive revisions to budget requests throughout our process.
We have another good question in the chat here. Do you have any recommendations for questions to ask agencies for status quo budget requests?
Yeah, I'll start off again. So in Georgia this year, the governor's instructions to his budget, his executive agencies were flat. So all of our agency requests were essentially, status quo. And I think part of that in some cases can be good because it gives you a dialogue to talk about things that members a lot of times want to see change or improvements in a way where, there hasn't been a long internal agency plan for how to address like their next movement. So we can kind of have a better dialogue about, hey, this is what members are saying they'd like to see improvements or change or addressing these challenges that we know you have. We know the request was flat, but what do you need, or how could we redeploy additional or existing resources to better meet this need? And I think sometimes knowing that they're not competing against something else they already asked for sometimes has a good conversation. In the same way that maybe you don't have in a year where there's a certain percentage or a certain nominal dollar value of enhancement or reduction. I would say the reduction side is a lot tougher. And that's kind of different, but status quo is an interesting piece about really getting into agency operations and asking them like, how does that get done? How could that get more efficient in finding budget savings there? Our folks I know are good at that.
Yeah, so I will add that it's easier to do when it's included in the instructions. If the governor sends instructions, as Melody stated, that tells agencies to fill out a budget request in a certain way, then that kind of helps that process. It doesn't mean that I don't have budget chairmen that want to ask additional questions or get agencies to submit additional information. That usually is followed with a bunch of whining on the executive side, but it can be done. It has been done. We have asked for, followed up and asked for, again, just that level fund. What do you do if you're level funded? What do you do if you get cut 5%? What do you do with a 5% increase? We've also asked the question, what do you do if your federal funding decreases by more than 5%? So that's going to be an issue we're probably going to get back to. And then I've also got a budget chairman right now that wants us to ask, what are you planning in terms of inflation? Have you factored that into your budget request, and to what extent? So we're probably going to send out some additional questions to the agencies even after they submit their budget request.
Other questions for Kirk or Melody, or anyone else want to chime in? Great. Well, Melody and Kirk, if you're okay with it, we can probably give folks a few minutes back of their Wednesday and wrap up.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for joining us. We definitely appreciate it.
Oh, quickly, I was just gonna to thank you both for all the great information in the presentation, and let everyone know that this recording will be posted hopefully by early next week on the same webpage where you registered. And also to keep an eye on that page for other upcoming virtual sessions. There's one next week on K-12 education funding. So if that happens to be your topic area, I hope you'll be able to join us. And finally, we're planning to meet in person for our professional development seminar, joint with several other professional development associations here at NCSL next year in Atlanta. So hopefully you all will be able to join us in person for that. Finally, just want to mention, I know a lot of you are newer analysts, so I'm NAPA's liaison to NCSL here, and happy to answer questions, help you with any research, and any other kind of support that you might need. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Hi, Erica.
Hi, Amy.
I just
Good
joined
to
in the
see
last
you.
few minutes. I was on a meeting, but I got over. So nice to see you.
How are you?
Good. Hoping for a win tonight against Vancouver.
Yeah, we're hoping for a win tonight too. I'm hoping for some home playoff games for the first time in a while.
Sure. I so badly wanted to come. I think it's this weekend to the game.
Yes, Saturday.
But
I will be there.
plane tickets are a little too expensive for me. So.
Well, if you
All
do
right.
come out here, you'll have to let me know.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye.